Thank you, all of you, for listening, or at least looking as if you're listening through the week. If you've got those verses from Mark's Gospel open in front of you, keep them there, please, because that's where we're going to be focusing this morning. But let me start with a story I heard about one of, he was a TV screenwriter for one of those Aussie soaps. And it was a wet, rainy afternoon. Filming was off. He was just stuck in his hotel room, and he didn't have anything else to do. He didn't have anything else to read, so he just picked up a Gideon Bible. He'd never read the Bible before. In fact, he just thought it was myth, and he started to read Mark's Gospel. And as he read, two things caught his attention. The first thing that struck him was that Mark, the writer, wrote in the style of a good journalist. The second thing that struck him was that the main character in this book didn't have any character flaws. And that astounded him because he said every good dramatist knows the fallibility of human nature and has to write in some flaw to each of their characters. And he struggled to balance this good journalist and this flawless main character, and that's what persuaded him to explore the Bible for himself. And no flaws. But as we see this morning, he lands up executed. Hold that for a moment. Then take this on board. Fast-moving films often slow down when they come to significant moments, don't they? Spoiler alert, The Greatest Showman clearly has plenty of fans here. If you're going to watch it tonight, as Tim explained on Tuesday evening, P.T. Barnum promotes a concert tour. He's a circus freak show promoter. And then he promotes this concert tour with Jenny Lind, the opera singer. And it goes all over America, and the camera goes from performance to performance, cutting at high speed from Lind singing on stage to Barnum waiting in the wings with eyes increasingly attracted towards her, to the audience rapt and enthralled by the music. And the camera goes from one show to the next until it finally stops focusing on Lind's final notes. The audience's rapturous applause. Barnum brought on stage, where she gives him a very passionate kiss before walking off the tour and leaving his marriage in jeopardy and his bank balance in ruins. But the film slows down because that's a significant moment in the story. Fact alert, extensive research on Wikipedia shows both Lind and Barnum made significant money off the tour. Lind gave all of hers to charity, and there was no romance. But don't let that put you off a great film, based on a true story, I'm sure they'll say somewhere, which for Hollywood means there's some truth in it somewhere. With Mark's true story, where the facts keep checking out, the camera moves at lightning pace, but slows down for Jesus' death and execution. His last 24 hours are spread over 2 long chapters. If you watch the Mark drama, you'll have noticed it faithfully slowed down so we could feel Gethsemane's agony and Judas's betrayal, the trial in justice and Peter's denial, the mob vote and Pilate's cowardice, the soldiers' violence and the crowd's mockery, the innocent Jesus nailed to a cross and the guilty Barabbas released. And you can't fail to ask, what is going on? And the only words of Jesus that Mark records from his 3 hours hanging on the cross, the only words are there in verse 34. My God, why have you forsaken me? Crucial words for Mark. The key, he obviously thinks, to unlocking the mystery of this extraordinarily significant death, but so often to us they are just a mystery. Step back again for a moment before we focus fully on it. I can remember talking with some Christian parents in their agony and distress, they were coming to terms with the teenage pregnancy of their daughter who was being educated in a Christian school. How did the school react? Oh, they expelled her. Why? Well, they're the type that find it too hard to handle when Christianity meets the real world. Ouch. We're in the real world this morning. Christianity is meeting the real world of Jesus' agonizing cry from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And some Christians find it too hard to handle. They've invested Jesus with an innocence, a divinity, an intimacy with God. They're making the model of all of those things rightly, and then they find it hard to come to terms with a cry like this. I've heard some tell me it's a cry of triumph. And when you ask why, they say, well, Jesus is quoting Psalm 22, which he is. And the psalm ends on a note of triumph, God hearing the cry for help, the Lord being praised for his righteousness, which is all true. But if it's the ending that Jesus intended to speak of, why only quote the beginning? I find it a little far-fetched to argue, as one writer did, that he was in too much pain to get beyond verse 1. Now, reality check needed. This isn't simply a cry of triumph. Well, others say it's a cry of loneliness. That they've faced those realities. They admit this is a cry of abandonment, but staring into the abyss where that might take you, they declare this is how Jesus felt at the moment, not how it was. Why have you forsaken me? Becomes not a complaint that God had abandoned him, but that God had allowed him to feel abandoned. And the feelings are true, as we'll see. The explanation's neat. But if you look at Psalm 22, it's not what Psalm 22 says. The psalmist doesn't speak of feelings, but of being. He's not saying, why are you so downcast, my soul? But, oh my God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. Reality check needed. It's not just a cry of how Jesus felt. And of course, it isn't just Christians who need the reality checks. More than once I've had this cry pointed out to me almost gleefully by non-Christians as a cry of doubt and despair. My God, why have you forsaken me? As if Jesus fell at the final hurdle. Cracked, showed he was what we would say, he was human after all. Well, he may not call God Father. And actually, it's the only recorded prayer where he doesn't. But then he is quoting Psalm 22. But he does pray, my God, my God. Reality check needed. It's not just a cry of doubt. It reflects many of our doubts and questions, but it's too glib to speak as if Jesus simply shared them. So, what is it? Let's try and face some more of the realities this morning. They're bleak, but they give us clues as to what to make of this cry. See, put it in the setting Mark puts it in, and look at the darkness of the scene in verse 33. Here's the background to it all. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. Now, if you've ever seen it, darkness in daytime is pretty eerie, isn't it? I don't know if you've ever seen an eclipse, which, by the way, scientifically, this couldn't possibly have been an eclipse, or even one of those days where the clouds are so thick and dark that it is dark in daytime. As Jesus is nailed to the cross, darkness falls, the darkest of all cries matched by the darkest of all skies. In the Bible, though, darkness in daytime is a pointer to God's judgment. Do you remember the Exodus and the plagues? The last plague before judgment fell on the firstborn was darkness. Darkness. Amos, the prophet, looked ahead to God's coming judgment on Israel, and he declared, I'll make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. And now, as Mark describes Good Friday, God has done precisely that. At noon, darkness came over the whole land. See, the backdrop to Jesus' cry is this darkness. It's not just a cry born out of the physical agony, though crucifixion was excruciatingly painful. This is a cry set against a backdrop of spiritual agony. As Jesus hung on the cross, it wasn't merely the rough justice of a rigged human trial he was tasting, but the raw judgment of God himself. The backdrop's deliberately ominous. It's as if the screens go blank. There's nothing to see now. And when you can't see anything, when it is all dark, your hearing is all the more acute. And when you hear the cry, the shock isn't that judgment's being tasted, but it's who's tasting it. You almost want to close your eyes at this point as you hear the crowd mocking and hurling their insults. You're going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Well, come down from the cross and save yourself. And then the next voice, he saved others. Let's see if he can save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we can see and believe. And in the midst of the shouts and the cries and the insults and the mockery, suddenly the last voice you expect to hear breaks in and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's Jesus crying. The darkness of the scene speaks of judgment. But it's also the darkness of separation. My God, why have you forsaken me? The horror is emphasized by almost every word. If you just stop and think and chew over that sentence. He's been through shame and nakedness and torture and pain, but for Jesus, this is the ultimate agony. For friends and disciples to betray and abandon him, that's bad enough, but this is almost too much. My God, why have you forsaken me? I was at a funeral a few months back. A couple who've been married for years, and one of the partners dies, and afterwards, just talking with friends and relatives, one of the lines that more than one person said to me of the wife, the widow who was left, said, I don't know how she'll cope. They did everything together. Well, it's like that here. The Father's world was Jesus' world. He did everything the Father told him. He spoke everything the Father had given him. Now you forsaken me. Why have you forsaken me? It was a new experience for Jesus. At his baptism, the heavens were torn open and God spoke. At his death, the heavens are closed. On the Mount of Transfiguration, God spoke, this is my Son whom I love. On the Mount of Calvary, God is silent. Ominously absent. Jesus left in shocking aloneness. Why have you forsaken me? And the more I think about it, I'm feeling the injustice of it all. So what must Jesus have felt? Why have you forsaken me? Me of all people, the innocent one, just faithfully doing your will, and now this abandoned. See, you put together what we've seen, the darkness of the scene, judgment falling, the darkness of the separation, judgment falling on Jesus. And the answer, of course, is to use another scripture from 2 Corinthians, that this is what happens when God made him, Jesus, to be sin who knew no sin. Jesus took the role voluntarily, willingly. It was his purpose and ambition. The Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many. But when God, who's of purer eyes than evil, made him to be sin who knew no sin, he had to look away. He had to turn his back on his Son and abandon him. Why? To deal with sin, to deal with our sin. God made him to be sin who knew no sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. That huge paradox of the innocent Jesus executed, the guilty Barabbas released, was a picture of exactly what was going on. The righteous one abandoned by God so that guilty ones could be made right with God. My God, why have you forsaken me? The cry may be a question because the psalmist framed it that way, but Jesus knows the answer, and it lies somewhere in those depths. The darkness of the scene, God's judgment falling. The darkness of the separation, God's judgment falling on Jesus. The darkness and the salvation, God's judgment falling to rescue. Ever been in one of those moments where someone has just been through the mill and you didn't really know anything about it and you suddenly kind of discover it and you say, why didn't you tell me? And they say to you, I didn't think you'd understand. And sometimes they're right, aren't they? I wonder if there have been moments when you've treated God like that. Just not bothered to talk to him about what you're going through because you didn't think he'd understand. I mean, what's the point in talking to him about it? What would he know about it? Well, remember, my God, why have you forsaken me? He knows more than we sometimes imagine. The writer to the Hebrews says, well, we don't have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. So what do I do with that truth? Well, he goes on, let's then approach the throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. You're not going to have a crowd like this without many people feeling they're victim of some kind of injustice. And I've just encountered more and more in recent years that have shown me how painful people find it when they feel injustice has been done to them and it can't be resolved. You're a victim? Well, you're not more of a victim than Jesus, the sinless one going through this. Why have you forsaken me? Have you ever spoken to him? Lord, you know. You know what it feels like. You can talk to the Lord about injustice. Or what about aloneness? Because for some people, life seems one long abandonment. Family, friends, gone. God, gone. You know, people who said they prayed and prayed and nothing. What some call the dark night of the soul is your experience. Ironic, even with the dark night of the soul, you can actually say, Lord, you know. Jesus, who tasted deeper darkness than that, my God, why have you forsaken me? The darkness tells me of a God who feels for me and feels with me, is not remote, has been there. You could talk about the darkness and the sympathy if you like, but let's stay real. My God, why have you forsaken me? This is more than just sympathy. More than God telling us he knows and he understands. This is God shining the light of his love into the darkness. This is an abandonment we need never know, because Jesus was God forsaken so that we need never be. Not in reality, not in the depths he was. I feel it, yeah, we might do that. Be it, we needn't. Handling that tension is important. Terry was a good friend. He was a Christian man. And depression hit him. And inevitably, as it drags you down, it affected his faith. And he kept wandering around saying, I'm God forsaken. I'm God forsaken. For 2 years or more, a friend and I would constantly say back to him, no, Terry, you're not. Jesus was God forsaken, so that you need never be. But it took years before that truth gripped him ahead of the depression. Actually, the picture isn't complete unless we follow Mark's camera as it whisks us from the darkness of Calvary in verses 33 and 34 to the bright lights of the temple and the shock of that curtain torn in two down in verse 38. You know, the curtain in the temple, it blocked off the Holy of Holies, the part of the temple where God's presence was. Massive, thick, all-hiding curtain. And only once a year, and only one person, the high priest, ever went through the curtain into where, so to speak, the presence of the holy God was. And now it's ripped in two, torn open. And the two things, the cry and the curtain, are inextricably linked. The darkness of judgment on Jesus leads to the light of access opened into the Holy of Holies, the very presence of God. Lord, you know. Yeah, well, what a relief to be able to say that to Almighty God. But Mark doesn't want to stop there. Now, he wants us to be able to say, Lord, you rescued. Lord, you know, he knows the darkness, so I can step into the light. Lord, you know. But some people seem almost to glory and revel in the dark night of the soul. Lord, you know, needs to be a cry to the God who welcomes us, not to a God who abandons us. People don't take it in all at once. Mark knows that. You read through this chapter and you find the soldiers in verse 24 are casting lots as they divide up Jesus' clothes to see what each would get. You know, they're gambling, throwing the dice, oblivious to the fact that above them, the world's salvation is being won. Some in the crowd try to engage, don't they? You saw that in verse 33. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then verse 35, when some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. And someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, offered it to Jesus to drink. Now, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. You know, they think they're engaging, but they're just muddled and confused, and they haven't got it at all. Remarkably, as Mark tells the story, it's the hard-bitten sergeant, the last person you would imagine who gets it, or at least speaks truer than he knew. See verse 37? With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Well, thanks, Mark, but what did he say? What was that all about? Watch. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last, and the camera switches from Calvary to the temple. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and that cry was mission accomplished. And then we're back to Calvary again. Verse 39, when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. This is God's Messiah. This is God's rescuer king. This is his Messiah's mission. And our response? Well, you see, if we've grasped Mark's story, we realize he's telling us that rescue has been won. We don't need to achieve it. We don't need to work for it. We don't need to impress for it. We just need to receive it. Someone said to me once, he said, Hugh, when were you saved? I said, good Good Friday, AD 33, just outside Jerusalem. For a second, I could see them computing, and they were thinking how much younger I looked than I must be. But then they would say, "No, come on, Hugh. I mean, be serious. When were you saved?" I said, "No, that's when I was saved." I said, I received the rescue in May 1970. The penny began to drop. You see, the rescue's been won. I have to ask, have you received it? And just because you're sitting in a tent in Forum doesn't mean you have. You'll never be in the right side of Mark's story unless you do. And if I've received it, well, then go and tell it. Go and tell it. And tell it realizing that here is the heart of the story, the good news story Mark wants to tell me. It's about what Jesus has done for me. Don't make the center of it what Jesus can do for me. No, it's sins forgiven. It's kingdom guaranteed. The Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many. My God, why have you forsaken me? Finished. Done. He's not here. He's risen. Here is your King, says Mark. Here's your Messiah. This is your rescue. This is your story. Mark's camera slowed because this matters. The thing about, events like Forum is slowing is a very difficult thing to do, isn't it? This meeting ends, we rush off, and there's another one to come, and one after that. So before we rush on, let Mark speak to you. Take time to respond. Well, whether God's calling you to himself or to his mission to uncover Mark. Let's take 2 long whole minutes before Andy comes and leads us and we sing again.